Zelensky. A few weeks ago, there was an article in the Time magazine where close advisors of Zelensky admitted that he has become, quote, crazy, and that high military leaders don't execute his commands. Do you think that the elites are done with Ukraine in the US and perhaps even in Europe? And you think Zelensky is out of his mind, as mentioned in this Time magazine article?
Well, first of all, let's step back for a moment and consider how America handles these kinds of problems historically. I always ask Europeans the same question. What did we do in Vietnam when the war effectively ended? And they all look at me strangely and I say, we left. We left. Now, what does that mean? Things didn't go our way. We failed miserably. So we tried to put up a facade and say that we had been as successful as we could. And then we quietly stopped funding everything and we walked away. What the Germans have never understood is that we Americans, like the British, are preeminently a maritime and aerospace power. We are not a land power in Eurasia. We are only a continental military power in the sense of ground forces in the Western Hemisphere. And when you have this background and historical experience, you learn that when things don't go your way, you can pack your bags and simply leave. And then the aftermath is everyone else's problem. And what happens inside the United States, where most Americans on any given day could care less what happens beyond their borders, is the media changes the subject. They don't talk about it anymore. I mean, what I thought was interesting is I would read these bulletins that would come out of the Pentagon, something called the Early Bird. And a friend of mine called me and said, have you seen today's Early Bird? I said, no, this is months ago. He said, no one's talking about Ukraine. Now they're talking about alleged aggressive moves by China in the South China Sea, which of course is nonsense. But that was a clear signal that we had effectively abandoned the effort in Ukraine. Charles de Gaulle got it right. Charles de Gaulle said in a speech, Europeans need to understand two things. Great Britain is an island, and Americans do not live in Europe. And I've often gotten into arguments with my German colleagues because I said, stop acting as though you have to apologize for 13 years of history. Germany is a great power. It has a role to play in Europe, an important role. You need to play it and stop being foolish and paying for this crime of 13 years. And it wasn't even 13 years. It was during the war itself. And by the way, nobody ever points out that Adolf Hitler couldn't have done anything without the active help and assistance and support of Stalin and the Soviet Union. You couldn't have gotten a single German tank fully fueled on its way into France or anywhere else without Soviet fuel, Soviet oil, Soviet gas, scarce minerals, rare earths, everything that you needed for the military machine all came out of the Soviet Union. No one ever brings that up. And so we give the Soviet a pass. The Soviet Union was a victim. Nonsense. The Soviet Union did everything it could to bankroll Hitler in the hopes that Western Europe would fight itself to a standstill. But nobody brings these things up. So let's stop all the nonsense about the Second World War. And I'm not interested in punishing Russia today for what the Soviets did either. The Russians have an important role to play in Europe. We should have turned to them early on and said, yes, you have an important role to play in Europe, just as Germany does, and embraced them and said, let's work together. We did the opposite. So this is a terrible set of circumstances now, and the Europeans are left holding the bag. And Putin today spoke, just before I came on, I read the text, and he said he has no intention of talking to anyone in Washington until after the next election. Well, why would he? All we've done is lie to the man about everything. And then we poured nothing but buckets of filth and abuse all over Putin and the Moscow government as though it were effectively Stalin, which it isn't, not at all. So, I think the Europeans now have to get involved and take a hand. You've got to find someone in Germany with the ability, the brains, the character, the courage to be chancellor. I don't have an answer for you, but you need one badly. And Germany can play a role in bringing this absolute monstrous catastrophe to an end. because no one else is going to do it. Washington's not going to do it. Washington has shifted attention entirely to Israel now in the Middle East. And as some of my friends point out, having made a terrible mess of Europe, now we're going to finish off the rest of the Middle East with more stupidity. I hope not. But, I don't have much hope these days for the people we have in power. And unlike you, we don't have a parliamentary system. So for the moment, we're stuck. You are not.
We are too. We have the worst government in history, actually. In the last 70 years, it's a nightmare. But what do you think? How will it end? You think, when will the war end? What's your scenario for the future? What do you think? How will this whole mess end?
Well, I think the Russians, who never had any interest in controlling Eastern Europe, are going to sit down and decide what they think the minimal requirements are for their long-term national security. I think the Russians will want to control those areas that are inhabited primarily by Russians. That means you move from Kharkov, which is historically a Russian-speaking city, all the way down to Odessa. Now, where the line is drawn across eastern Ukraine, whether they go to Zaporozhye and then from Zaporozhye over further east, I have no idea. And I think that's what, and they'll want neutrality for whatever survives of Ukraine. But again, people have said, well, what about Poland? Does Poland have a role to play? I would tell you, frankly, that if the Poles were not in NATO, and unfortunately for Russia, they are, I don't think the Russians would care who controlled Western Ukraine. They just don't want a hostile party there. The problem for Warsaw is it's demonstrated that it too is incurably hostile. Now that could change, but for the moment, that's the situation. So I think the Russians will determine these are our minimal requirements. And then I think they'll look for partners in Europe. And the only partner historically that the Russians have ever been able to look to with any reliability is Berlin.
Not anymore, with all the sanctions and Nord Stream. So
but the Russians did not blow up Nord Stream.
That's the next question, actually. What do you think? Who was it?
Well, first of all, I don't have access right now because I'm on the outside of the administration. Even though I have a top secret clearance, I don't have access to precise information. But I think it's pretty clear that we had a hand in it. Because you have all the senior political figures from Victoria Nuland, the architect of catastrophe in Ukraine, as well as President Biden himself, all saying, if this war breaks out, we will stop it. There will be no transit of liquefied natural gas or oil or anything else from Russia into Germany. And when I was working for President Trump, I actually wrote a short memo because I was trying to convince people that Russia is not the Soviet Union, and good business between Germany and Russia is not evil, and we should not view it negatively. Of course, he was voted out of office and never had a chance to really act on any of it, but he was replaced by people who were just, in my judgment, out of touch with reality and determined to bring on a war. They succeeded. Now it's being lost by all of the people that we supported. So the question is, what will the Russians do? I think they will exercise patience. They'll try to bring an end to this. They'll try to have a Ukrainian partner to talk to. There may be some Ukrainian military leaders who are willing to sit down with them to put an end to this travesty. I don't know. But again, I think they would like some European partners. And originally, when I was recommending neutrality for Ukraine, and this is back in 2014, I said, you've got to have a conference and you've got to have the leadership of all the states that border Russia: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania. Everyone needs to sign up for this neutrality. And then you need, as a minimum, preferably Berlin and Paris to sign on for it. But nothing ever happened. But that, again, something like that has to happen eventually to put an end to this travesty in Eastern Europe.
You mentioned that Victoria Nuland, who also said "fuck the EU," has her hand into this whole mess in the Ukraine. And we all know in 2014, I think the US spent like $5 billion in the regime change in Kiev. So perhaps you can tell our audience what exactly happened, or what do you think what people have to know about this regime change?
I think they should understand that there was a deliberate coup. Americans working closely with the Central Intelligence Agency, people like Newland and others, systematically installed a new government composed of people that would do business with us. In other words, who would carry out our aims in the region, who were sufficiently anti-Russian, if you will. The Russians were unprepared for it. And I think this is, if I were going to offer some criticism of Putin, I'd say his greatest weakness was that he failed to appreciate just how malevolent, mendacious the American government was towards his government in Moscow. I don't think he understood what we were up to initially. When he found out, it was too late. And of course, he goes into Crimea in large part as a signal to us, don't try to push this any further, because if you do, you'll end up at war with us. He was quite convinced, and with good reason, that if he didn't do something about Crimea, Sebastopol would host NATO naval forces. And he's right. So I think it took him a while to figure this out. I think the same thing was true. You talked about the deal that was on the table in March. Again, I think he imputed more goodwill to us than was present. And some of that must have had to do with Trump, because, there were certainly people in his administration, unfortunately, who actively subverted President Trump and were always, I would say, regime change oriented everywhere, not simply in Russia. But Donald Trump was not. And the last thing that Trump wanted was a war. In fact, he made that very clear in private. So I think that's part of the reason that he thought, well, perhaps there's a way through this. He found out the hard way there wasn't. And that's, in my judgment, also very damaging for Europeans, because there has always been a strong school on one side in Russia that is fundamentally, incurably anti-Western, that views the West as evil incarnate and something that Russia can never enjoy peace with. On the other hand, you have the Western school that says, no, 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 we are still part of Europe. We have interests in Europe, business interests, and we want to develop those. And that, of course, was Putin. And Putin was remarkable because he was probably, and I shouldn't say in past tense, but he is probably the one person who knows more about the West than almost anyone else who's ruled that country in the last, 100 years. So I think it was a terrible missed opportunity for everyone. And of course, Trump was not reelected, and the new regime coming in was, from the very beginning, always anxious to promote hostility to Moscow. And I saw this, by the way, when I was involved in the Kosovo Air Campaign, and I was the director of the Joint Operations Center. Very senior people on the American side told me, you don't understand, Douglas. We are starting a democratic revolution in Yugoslavia. We're going to sweep Milosevic and his friends out of Belgrade, and then the revolution is going to sweep all the way to Moscow. Now, imagine, this is December 1998 when I was told that. And I thought these people were deranged at the time, and I simply said, this is not going to happen. And if you try to do it, it's going to precipitate conflict that we don't really need and will not help Europe. But I was told I didn't understand. I didn't know what I was doing. So I shut up and went back to doing my job. But the point is, this was not a new phenomenon. This had germinated in the 90s. You've got to go back and understand this crazy notion that in 1992, in the aftermath of Desert Storm, we are unchallenged. We are the superpower of all time. We can now reshape the world as we see fit. When I say we, I'm not talking about the American people. Remember, the American people were never consulted. The American people, frankly, don't care. If you and I went to Kansas City, Missouri, and we started interviewing people at random off the street, I wager that more than half of them don't even know what NATO is.